The medieval era is hands down my favorite period of history. Everything is so fascinating to me about this era. The weird practices, laws and traditions, social classes, but above all else, my favorite is knights, if that wasn't obvious enough already. Knights were a staple of the medieval period, defending castles or going to war. But what if I told you that these ancient medieval knights used guns? This might seem extremely odd, and it is for sure, but let me give you a little lesson in history and you'll see why. Knights were fearsome warriors. They were experts in combat, trained for decades, and suited up in masterfully crafted metal armor that made them nearly impervious to any attacks. Knights were amazing soldiers and a staple of the medieval time period. So why did these incredible fighters become obsolete? Well, the short and simple answer is, obviously, guns. But why specifically did guns just entirely make knights irrelevant? Knights were very expensive and time consuming to produce. As such, they were in much more limited numbers. Firstly, the limited social class allowed for only a small part of the population to become knights. Merchants and serfs had little to no opportunity in advancement in the social class pyramid. Only people born of nobility were able to become knights. From there, it took decades of training from squiredom to full knighthood. Knights had to master hand-to-hand combat as well as multiple weapons such as swords, bows, maces, daggers, etc. That's not even to mention the armor. Knight armor is very cool, but it was understandably very expensive. Metal was not as common in the medieval times for one thing, which made armor exponentially more expensive. But it also had to be handmade from a blacksmith and it took years to produce. Because of this, knights were very costly and difficult to produce. In a medieval army, estimates of knights were between 20 to 30% at the start of knight usage. And keep in mind, this is when knights were far less advanced and armor looked like this. As knights advanced in skill and armor, the figure dropped to an estimated 6% by the year 1380. Think of knights like commanders or officers in the modern day military. So it was only natural that when a far cheaper and more effective replacement came along, knights were phased out and they stopped being produced. But where did guns come from? Guns were estimated to be invented in China around the Ming Dynasty in 1200 AD. These guns were much different from the ones you know today and were more like handheld cannons. Once gunpowder was invented, it wasn't too long before cannons and guns followed. Over the next century, the invention spread across the Eurasia area through the Silk Road, a Chinese trade route. But guns didn't replace knights and other weapons overnight. These primitive guns were much slower to use and reload than a bow. They were also far less accurate and a danger to their users. For a time, knights and other medieval weaponry were still far more effective. It was in this period of overlap with the slow advancement of guns that knights adopted the usage of guns. It wasn't long before guns became extremely popular and widespread. Guns, once some advances were made of course, were much more accurate and less technical than a bow. Instead of taking decades to master a bow or crossbow, a gun could be mastered by a civilian in a matter of months. This was huge for armies. Knights were no longer the carrying brute forces of the armies, and soldiers became much more replaceable yet effective. It was also much more cost effective to lose an average civilian who used a gun than a knight who trained for decades. Like I said earlier, it's only natural that the more effective and cheaper option replaced the more primitive one. And that's exactly what happened to knights. Slowly, they became more and more obsolete until being replaced altogether at the height of the Renaissance. And now, sadly, they're not much more than a romanticized relic of the past. So when did knights use guns, and what was it like? Well, I'm glad you asked, random person behind the screen. This is totally not scripted, so I can seamlessly discuss my next point. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when knights began using guns, but they may have been put into widespread use with the invention of the petronel, a firearm designed for horseback all the way until around the 1600s. With the Renaissance transitioning out of fiefdom and the medieval ways, this is around the point when knights phased out of use. But when knights and guns did coexist, they were often used in place of bows and lances as they had farther reach and more accuracy. The invention of the pistol around 1500 furthered this and became a knight's weapon of choice on horseback and is, interestingly enough, still the officer's choice of weapon in the modern military to this day. Early guns were terrible, and as such, knight armor was still relatively bulletproof for several centuries. Inventions like the matchlock musket around the 1600s were able to pierce most armor, however. One commonplace tactic was to have two pistols, shoot them both at the enemy on horseback, then discard of the guns and charge with a sword. Medieval battles were wild, man. Knights using guns is fascinating for many reasons. For one, it challenges your perspective and perception of history. Knights in medieval culture as a whole is seen as ancient and entirely separate from our world today. Guns are still very much used to this day and likely will be for a very long time. So seeing the two technologies overlap is a bit odd and interesting nonetheless. It's also just cool. Guns, especially early ones that had to be manually loaded, are very cool to me. Despite how cool guns are, I firmly believe that they ruined war. War used to be so cool and interesting in medieval times. Knights had a huge variety of weapons that are so cool I might make a separate video on them alone. Hand-to-hand combat was tactical and versatile, and the idea of men in huge plated metal armor wrestling and fighting with huge metal blades is awesome as hell. Modern war is cool in its own right, but it boils down to a bunch of dudes in camos shooting guns. I will die on this hill that medieval warfare is better than modern warfare. Fight me. So this video is a bit shorter than I expected, so I decided to make a small bonus segment about weird swords. There have been many weapons throughout history, and as is natural for human nature, we try out many various weird ideas and see if they work. So here are some extremely weird swords. First is a khopesh. Now this isn't so much as a sword as it is a sickle, but I digress. This weapon was derived from battle axes and was mainly used in Egypt. This weapon is actually really interesting and effective, combining the best of swords and axes alike. It allows for very quick and agile movements. Unlike the khopesh, the flambridge is completely ineffective. It's a two-handed sword with a weird wiggly blade. Why does it exist? The makers wanted to combine the cutting power of a curved blade and the versatility of a straight blade, which resulted in complete failure and it's basically useless. This is the urumi, otherwise known as the whip sword. It originated in southern India and, well, it's surprisingly effective actually. Due to its vast reach and flexibility, it was used to fight off multiple enemies. And for some reason, people like the Sri Lankans just decided to keep adding blades. Like, what? Why do you need 32 whole blades? Here is the Italian boarding sword. It's, interesting to say the least. But it was double effective actually, both useful for self-defense and cutting rope. And finally, this is the shodel. It was originally used in Ethiopia around 700 BC and looks, straight out of a comic book. Also, a bonus non-sword weapon. Apparently, people in China and Japan made these things called bee bombs. They're exactly what they sound like because they're literally containers filled with live bees and they're thrown at the enemy. What? What in the world? People in ancient times were so crazy, absolutely unhinged. So yeah, this was a super fun video to make. I love how weird and quirky history is, and the knights with guns and the weird various swords just prove that. If you like history videos like these, let me know. I will certainly make more. Feel free to point out any factual errors or any additional info in the comments, and I'll be glad to have it. Either way, thanks for watching. See you next time, and subscribe.